6 News, because you matter.
Your hard-earned money and how the state is spending it. That's what we set out to do a story about.
But Fox 6 anchor Brad Hicks discovered something else along the way, something would send him searching for answers from a Fond du Lac attorney. Brad's in the studio tonight, right?
Yeah, you know, sometimes stories take an unexpected turn, and that's what happened when we started doing some research for a piece about taxpayer money being spent to help sex offenders.
Kirk Everson is proud to promote his Fond du Lac County Compost Company.
Why don't you call Compost Joe?
He's not afraid of the limelight he gets as a lawyer.
And I don't believe that there was any intent for any of this to happen the way that it did.
He's even a bit of a ham.
Fully satisfied with your long-distance carrier.
Appearing in the popular Chad Vader spoofs. But there is one question that leaves him camera shy. One business he doesn't want to talk about.
Why is he being so elusive?
Not at his office.
No comment, I'm sorry.
Not at his home.
No comment, thank you.
Not over the phone.
Attorney Everson and his client are not in the courthouse.
Not even after court.
I expect them to be here today.
It seems Kirk Everson will do just about anything to avoid talking to us about the business.
My mother and father bought the house almost 60 years ago.
Steve Troskin wishes he'd heard about Kirk Everson.
I grew up there.
When he moved his mom from the family home to assisted living,
You know, the house wasn't selling.
until someone swooped in with a cash offer.
From what I understand, the man was a lawyer from Fond du Lac.
And then he found out.
My sister and I would have never sold the house if we would have known this.
Sand Ridge in Juneau County treats the worst sex offenders in Wisconsin. The men who, after their prison terms, are still too dangerous to set free. They're committed here to be treated. Most will never get out. But each year, a handful make enough progress that the state orders they be returned to the community, supervised and under tight restrictions. Right now, there are 33 sexually violent offenders under supervised release. The Department of Health Services returns them to the county from which they came. It's never popular when an offender is placed, but the law says they have to be. They live in rented homes, homes the state pays for at prices
I got 3 bedrooms in a basement. This is a flat.
that are nothing like what the neighbors pay.
And what do you pay per month?
My rent is about $900.
But right across this Milwaukee street, the state houses a sex offender here for $1,900.
Really?
Same size.
Wow.
It's not an anomaly.
I know what my rent is.
It's the norm.
What do you pay per month?
I pay $650.
But next to Lydia Nichols' new 2-bedroom in Manitowoc is this 1-bedroom. And to house a sex offender here, the state coughs up $1,600 a month.
That's way too much.
The state says the rents are so high because it's so hard to find suitable housing. For starters, not a lot of people want to rent to the violent sex offender program. It can be risky for a landlord's reputation. Also, some places, like Racine just last month, are tightening the reins on where sex offenders can live.
Which in turn wipes out all the rental market around those places, leaving very few homes that are available.
Bob Peterson should know. As a lawyer, he represents many of the sex offenders at Sand Ridge, and he has seen how hard it can be to place them. He points out if more people were willing or able to rent, the rents would go down.
And if you have an individual who's willing to do that, I look at it as they're doing the public a service.
And from that perspective, no one is providing a bigger public service than a company called Irvin J. Fenske. That Milwaukee home renting for $1,900 and the Manitowoc one for $1,600, both Fenske properties. The company also owns this home Wisconsin rents for a sex offender in Wheatland, and this one in Beloit, and Eau Claire, and Marathon County. In fact, of the 30 homes the state rents for sexually violent offenders, Fenske owns 20% of them. So who is behind this company? We asked the attorney who filed the initial papers.
I'm going to ask you guys to leave now.
We asked the attorney who's listed as the current contact.
And you guys can see yourself to the door.
Seems no one wants to talk about the company, not even Kirk Everson. Everson owns 2 sex offender homes in his own name, this one in Green Bay and this one near Fond du Lac. But his most frequent ties seem to be the Fenske properties. And Fenske isn't the only rental company Kirk Everson is involved with. Remember Steve Troskin, the man who sold his mom's home in Milwaukee? The buyer was a company called Donald F. Wilson, Jr. Weeks after closing, the Wilson Company rented it to the state for a couple of violent sex offenders on supervised release. In all, Everson and the two companies, Fenske and Wilson, own 9 homes the state rents for sex offenders, properties that rake in more than $200,000 a year.
I think he looks out for Mr. Everson.
At a sex offender community notification meeting,
He just tries to get away with everything.
neighbors just learned about him last month.
This owner has kind of a large chunk of the market.
The Department of Health Services, which signs the contracts, refused an interview for this story, but we submitted a written question at that meeting. How does Everson even know which homes to buy? Turns out the state
We will locate a residence that we know might be for sale,
tips him off.
and then we approach this individual and ask him if he'd be willing to purchase it on our behalf.
But it was when we were researching the Wilson Company that we noticed something wasn't adding up. Back in March, when the company bought Steve Troskin's home, the legal contact person for the company was suddenly changed to Paul Miller, spelled Mueller. Paul Miller's signature even appears on the documents, but the credit card that paid for that change was Kirk Everson's. And at the same time, someone calling themselves Don Wilson from the Donald F. Wilson Company tried to open a Milwaukee mailing address for Paul Miller and the company inside this building of short lease office space. The address was never approved because this Don Wilson couldn't produce 2 forms of ID. But sources say the credit card used to try to open that mailing address, again, Kirk Everson's. And Paul Miller's name and signature also appear on the annual corporate filings for the Fenske Company. But the filings were paid for by, well, you guessed it, Kirk Everson's credit card. In fact, every time Paul Miller's name was used on corporate filings with the state, the fees were paid by Kirk Everson.
Excuse me, Paul.
So we went to Paul Miller's house to ask him about that.
Do you know what Irvin J. Fenske LLC is?
No idea what it is.
Donald F. Wilson Jr. LLC.
No idea.
You're Paul?
Paul Miller.
Really?
Yes.
And you've never heard of Irvin J. Fenske LLC?
Heard of Irvin J. Fenske. Never heard of whatever the other one is.
Do you know what this company does?
No idea.
Really?
Yeah, I have no idea.
Okay.
What do they do?
They rent homes to sex offenders.
Okay.
And that's news to you.
That's news to me.
And yet your name is all over this company.
Okay, that's news to me. I don't know anything about it.
Are you surprised?
I'm very surprised to hear this.
But there is one name.
Let me run some names by you.
He has heard of.
Kirk Everson is a good friend of mine. I've been friends with him for over 20 years. Went to high school with him.
Which raises the question, how did Paul Miller's name and signature find their way on those legal documents?
I can't even guess what might be happening.
And Kirk Everson refuses to answer the question. We called, we knocked, we waited day after day. He did send this letter citing attorney-client privilege. In other words, he won't talk about the companies. Seems the only dirt he wants anybody to know about is the compost he makes.
Compost Joe.
And there is yet another company tied to all this, Housing Opportunities and Program Services. That's who the state actually pays the money to. HOPS, as it's called, collects the rents for both the Fenske companies and the 2 homes Everson owns in his own name.
Back to the rents, they're astronomical, especially compared to what the the people in that area are paying. Yeah. So why can't the state just refuse to pay the rents? Because the taxpayers pay that rent, essentially.
Well, they don't have a lot of options. As one representative from the Department of Health Services put it at that community notification meeting, the state isn't in the driver's seat. The landlords really are. However, lawmakers in Madison, they are taking notice. A joint audit committee has asked the state audit board to take a look at the supervised release program at Sand Ridge, compare it to other states, come up with some recommendations. And they may include a live-work facility that's centralized where they would all go to, but plans for a facility like that were actually scrapped a few years back.
Would have loved to heard the phone call when Paul Miller calls Everson and said, why is my name on this?
That's exactly what we talked about when we left Paul Miller's house when we were in the vehicle. The photographer and I were like, well, that's going to be an interesting conversation.
Great story.
so
Interesting
much.
can happen
Yeah.
when you start pulling on a thread.
Yeah, all right. Thanks. Thank you, Brad.
Countless hours of cramming, tons of test takes.